Hi everyone, welcome to the third part of this seventh lecture. I'm going to continue to work with our data from Brazilian Portuguese in order to see how our rules that we've established, our processes of stress shift, mid-vowel raising, palatalization, and let's not forget about low vowel raising, interact with one another. Let's take another example. So we've just worked with the verbal root ar, burn. Let's take another example using the verbal root pod, be able. Here we have the infinitive forms puder and the third singular present form pode. And we can see in this case the same interactions that we've just established. So here I've been explicit showing the morphological buildup of these forms. We begin from the root pod in both cases. Then the stems, which can be inflected, are built up by adding the suffix a. The infinitive is further built by adding a suffix ra. These were the morphological rules which were introduced at the bottom of the previous page. And then in the phonology, first the stress shift moves the stress to the syllable of the infinitive. Mid-vowel raising applies, causing any unstressed mid-vowels to become high tense vowels. So the underlying o of the root becomes u in the infinitive. And in the third singular, the a of the second conjugation suffix becomes e, just as we saw with the verb meaning burn. And finally, palatalization is able to apply here, since we have an instance of a coronal stop preceding a vowel e. So the result then are the forms puder, to which mid-vowel raising has applied, and pode, to which both mid-vowel raising and palatalization had applied. If instead we imagine that the forms were puder, as actually exists, and pode without palatalization, as we already mentioned, we would know that the interaction between palatalization and mid-vowel raising would be an interaction of counterfeeding. Palatalization would have tried to apply too soon, before mid-vowel raising created an e that was a vowel e that was necessary for palatalization to be able to apply. Let's now think further about the interaction between mid-vowel raising and low vowel raising, which I mentioned earlier. And let's take as an example the derived form of the word sack in the data on the first page. So this is in row number 5, the word for sack, and the word for handbag. The word for handbag is socolo. Now here, we want to make sure, based on the two rules of mid-vowel raising and low vowel raising, that we don't ultimately have central high vowels, I, that we don't derive a form sicole rather than sacole. And you might ask yourself, well, on what basis are you worrying about this hypothetical form sicole with high central vowels I at all? And the issue here is that, as I mentioned earlier, low vowel raising creates a new mid-vowel. So the schwa, when low vowel raising applies to an underlying a and creates a schwa, that schwa is now minus low, right? But minus low vowels are precisely constitute the input to the process of mid-vowel raising. So if mid-vowels become high vowels, now low vowels become high vowels, then low vowel raising could potentially feed mid-vowel raising. So in that situation, an underlying unstressed a would first become a schwa by low vowel raising, and then, since the vowel is already unstressed but now minus low, mid-vowel raising would be able to apply and create the central vowel I out of the high central vowel I. we'll say plus high vowel. But we don't find in Brazilian Portuguese any instance of this plus high vowel at all. So the opposite ordering must be the correct ordering of the two rules. That is, in order to ensure that we never derive a vowel, a high central vowel I from an underlying A, we require the rule ordering first mid vowel raising and then low vowel raising. So if mid vowel raising tries to apply first to an underlying A, as in, let's actually use the example that I've given here, this word, sekolah, that word will have two underlying A vowels. Mid vowel raising doesn't apply at all to this underlying form because the only mid vowel is in a stressed syllable. Subsequently, low vowel raising will apply to these two unstressed A vowels, and we thereby obtain the form that actually occurs with two schwas, sekolah. And we would call this order a counter-feeding order. So in the event that low vowel raising had created new inputs for mid vowel raising, that would be a case of feeding. But since mid vowel raising applies too soon and low vowel raising is not able to feed mid vowel raising, we can call this a case of counter-feeding. And right, so this is what I've said. And Hasa diagrams, which I briefly introduced at the end of lecture 6 here, can be used to show the crucial ordering relationships that we've already established. And we can more precisely say what the ordering relations are between these rules. So based on what we've already said, the stress shift rule bleeds instances of mid vowel raising because stress shift can remove possible inputs to mid vowel raising. Then mid vowel raising feeds palatalization. Mid vowel raising creates new high front vowels, E, that allow palatalization to apply. And low vowel raising counterfeeds mid vowel raising. So low vowel raising has the potential to feed mid vowel raising based on the way the rule is written, but it doesn't actually. So low vowel raising counterfeeds mid vowel raising, as we've just discussed. So looking at point 5 here on the handout, note that although mid vowel raising precedes these two rules of palatalization and low vowel raising, the relationship between mid vowel raising and palatalization is different in each case. Mid vowel raising feeds palatalization, but low vowel raising counterfeeds mid vowel raising. And the Hasa diagram itself doesn't tell you anything about the nature of the relationship between the rules. It only shows what the necessary ordering is, but you could potentially, as I've done here on the handout, write in further information about the nature of the relationship between the rules. Okay, let's now move on to looking at another further rule, which has some further effects. So I'll just tell you what this rule is, and then I'll show you some cases in which it applies. We'll think about this a little bit. So this rule of E epenthesis states that a vowel E will be inserted between a non-continuant sonorant and a non-syllabic sound or a word boundary. So here the brackets here show that it could either be a non-syllabic sound or a word. So based on what sounds we've seen in Brazilian Portuguese, we think about where this might apply. So what are non-sonorant non-continuant sounds in the language? Those are going to be, of course, the stops. And there are of course, affricates on the surface in Brazilian Portuguese, but they aren't there underlying. They are only derived through palatalization. So let's see an example in which this rule applies. The word for laptop, a laptop computer, laptop, has stress on the second syllable in Brazilian Portuguese. In this case, we're going to get epenthesis of that E at the end of a word, because there is here we have a non-sonorant, non-continuant sound, and that's at a word boundary. Let's consider how this rule might also interact with our existing rules. So again, this rule is creating an E, and it should then be clear that it could potentially interact with palatalization, because if an E were inserted following a coronal stop, it could create an environment for the application of palatalization. So again, the question will be, does this process of epenthesis feed palatalization, or does it counterfeed palatalization? Does it apply too late in order for palatalization to apply? So let's consider a word in which we actually do have a coronal stop at the end of a word. So the word for internet, internet, and we can consider the two possibilities. That's either going to surface as interneti with no affricate, or interneti with an affricate. And it turns out that the form which actually occurs in Brazilian Portuguese has the affricate ch. I wanted to highlight that here. So this means that there must be a feeding interaction between E epenthesis and palatalization. E epenthesis needs to precede palatalization. So here, again, assuming that the stress shift applies before all other words, which we can clearly see is the case in before all other rules, in our Hasa diagram, I'll insert the process of epenthesis here, and will reflect the fact that it needs to apply before palatalization, and it also applies after mid-vowel raising. And yeah, the reason why we'll think that the stress shift precedes it is because the epenthetic E never bears stress. So the fact that the epenthetic E never has the primary stress shows that there can't be any processes that move the stress around in the language that would cause this epenthetic vowel to become stressed. Okay, so that essentially covers our example in Brazilian Portuguese. We began by looking at some alternations in the forms of stems, and on the basis of those alternations, we were able to establish some allophonic processes for vowels. And then, just by looking at some static data and looking at the distribution of coronal stops and palatal alveolar affricates, alveolar stops rather, we were able to establish a process of palatalization. And from there, we were able to work out the interaction between those processes and ultimately come to the conclusion that our rule of mid-vowel raising needed to precede the processes of mid-vowel raising and palatalization. And lastly, we introduced a further process of E epenthesis, which turned out to also have to feed the process of palatalization. So that concludes our brief look at Brazilian Portuguese data, and we can now take another short break before moving on to data from the Karo language.